everyone, fall in for another episode of Tactical Plastic Report, where I talk about Army Men, a game of tactical plastic. Since we're on our third episode now, I figured it was time for me to actually make good and start talking about the nations of the Plastos Federation, and to open the door and give folks watching an entryway into the setting, so you can sort of explore at your own pace and decide if this is something you want to know more about. Now, there are 4 existing nations of the Plastos Federation, one of which is 2 countries smushed together, but we'll get to them in another video. And today I wanted to start with one of the ones that is currently oldest in terms of the longest running existing government structure that has not been usurped or altered or changed. And for that, we have the constitutional monarchy of United Polymeria. I hesitated because some people refer to it as parliamentary monarchy, but that really comes down to splitting hairs and who you're talking to in the setting. But United Polymeria is the northwesternmost nation of this particular confederacy, though we tended not to call it that, and it is the dominant naval power amongst the 4 of them. Now, each of the nations have their own navy, they have their own militaries of all stripes, but when you think of who is going to win a battle on the water, United Polymeria is usually who comes to mind. Now, they have their parliament, which was formerly referred to as the Wheel, and that's going to be important here in a moment. But for folks who are looking for the inspiration for United Polymeria and what sort of shaped it as I created it as a country, I wanted to combine the obvious nod to the United Kingdom and England's Great Navy, and the fact that the khaki-colored army men, if you actually buy the armies in the little plastic bags, is supposed to be the United Kingdom. That's the nation ascribed to that particular color, so you could keep track of who's fighting who. But I didn't just want to make a carbon copy of, the England that we all know and love, or at least the version of it that we made toys based off of. I wanted to combine a bit of Arthurian myth and a little bit of the inspiration from the Danelaw, and when, the Norsemen came to that little island and decided they wanted a part of it. So the history of the country is a bit of a mishmash, but come with me on this little journey and I'll give you a very brief rundown of what led to them becoming what they are now. But if we rewind the clock several centuries, back before we had ironclad ships, before artillery and guns were what they are now, when the claymore and the longbow were still the standard weapon of choice for soldiers and warriors in the field, you have a nation made up of various warring and cooperating clans. There isn't really an overall structure of government. There's not what you would call a nation, but there are agreements between the northern and southern clans, and that's sort of the major differentiation we have in the land that will become United Polymeria. And even at this point, we see the early burgeoning power of their naval forces. We see their sailors, their fishermen. They are very skilled upon the water, whether it's the great freshwater sea that many of the nations of the Federation surround, or whether it's the lakes, the streams, the rivers that go all throughout the area that will become this country. There is a definite skill set being drawn on. But the deciding moment that led to what would become the forging of a nation was when several southern clans decided to assault a city that was referred to as the Gateway to the North. It is unclear in some of the history texts as to why this happened, because it was so long ago, and history is written by the winners, and the South did not win this particular battle. But some have theorized they just wanted plunder, they had had a bad season, they were tired of going through all of the hard work it took to raise crops, raise families, etc., and they decided to just take it from their northern neighbors. Unfortunately, this set off a Rube Goldberg device, because there were agreements in place, there were clan loyalties, there were intermarriages, and this led the Highland clans of the North, who were much more cooperative, because fighting wars in the northern cold was not something anyone wanted to do. So they all came together and marched on the south. This, of course, led the southern clans to enact their own agreements and various clan affiliations and loyalties, and the war began. Now, it's said that most, if not all, of the clans of what would become United Polymeria were drawn into this conflict. And at the end of the day, their war king of the north was the one who stood victorious. And there were lots of things that could have been done at that point. There could have been retribution, there could have been extraordinarily punitive measures that were put in place, but wisdom prevailed, and what happened to prevent future versions of this conflict happening was they formed an official agreement referred to as the Wheel. The way the Wheel was set up was that it was a very large round table, which might sound familiar to those of you familiar with the legends and mythology out of the United Kingdom. And at every spoke of the wheel, a clan leader would sit, and they would have a voice in decisions being made, not just in their area, but throughout the entirety of this country. And rather than simply allowing all of the Highlanders to hold the table and make decisions, the king did offer, well, an olive branch to several of the southern clan heads who either had surrendered or had comported themselves with honor, and he felt were trustworthy. And so the wheel expanded, and everyone, within reason, found that they had a seat and that their voice would be heard, so that in the future, these kinds of conflicts would not be necessary to solve problems. And if someone did step out of line and raid a city or attempt to steal things from another clan, there was a measure in place so that you didn't have to call your banners and get all of your countrymen to go and take back what was looted from you with fire and steel. Now, this was a very small measure that created what we now have of, as the wheel grew, it became a genuine parliament. As that happened, the position of the monarch waxed and then waned in power, and over the past several generations, the monarchy has actually grown more ceremonial. They were never entirely ceremonial. They always had certain government powers that they could exercise. But it was slowly fading out as people entered the modern day, and they felt that having a king, having a queen, was no longer really what their nation needed, but they didn't want to get rid of it entirely. This was, of course, until Queen Mary II took the throne, and conveniently for her, the Vespoid threat reared its very ugly head, which meant that between all of the fear that was causing, all of the mustering, all of the violence that was happening, it meant that people were looking for a leader. They were looking for solutions, and she began to exercise war powers that had not been used by the monarchy for some time. And thus United Polymeria began its buildup and began to reinvigorate its military. It was never gone entirely. It was always a matter of pride to serve either on a ship or in the army. But once there was a genuine threat that people throughout the nation felt needed to be combated, many people started signing up who previously would not have. And in addition to that, we had lots of retired soldiers decide that it was time to join their countrymen and make sure that they passed on the knowledge they had before something bad happened to the next generation. And that is where we find ourselves with United Polymeria in the present. They have invested a great deal of their treasury, a great deal of their people, their will, their spirit, into becoming one of the major military powers of Placidos Federation. And while they are not the nation that proposed the Federation in the first place, because the Federation has only existed for about 50 years or so, and it was created during the early stages of the Vespoid conflict, we will get to that bit of history later when we talk about the Federation itself. But it is in many ways the eldest sibling of this particular group of nations, because while the people of these nations have always existed, there have always been borders, there have always been governments, United Polymeria is the longest running of them, and it has been present during the creation and the maturation of all of its neighbors. So whether someone was an ally, whether they were an antagonist toward the crown, they've always been there, and that gives them a weight of history that is very difficult to ignore when it comes to sitting at the table and making diplomatic decisions, or when it comes to making certain that certain military measures are put in place. They are, if not the first among equals, definitely a voice that people listen to, because even though monarchies may be on their way out, they may not be a thing that are terribly popular in the rest of the Federation, There is no denying that when push came to shove, United Polymeria answered the call and has held its border and sent troops to assist the others in their needs. Now, that's a brief history of them. That's their government structure. That's a sort of nod to the real-world nations in history that have led to their creation. But I wanted to ask folks out there, is this something you want to see more of with the other nations as far as format goes? Do you have more details you want to know about United Polymeria that I did not touch on that you feel are important in knowing whether or not this is a nation you want to either set your campaign in or if you want your troopers to come from? Or are there other details I left out that you feel were important that should be made present? Let me know in the comments below. I will do my best to answer all the questions there, and I will use that as kind of a guide to expand the future episodes that I do about the nations of the Placidos Federation. Also, while we're discussing things to be left in the comments, while I intend on covering the rest of the nations of the setting, I want to know from you, what other questions do you have about army men? Do you want to know more about the Vespoid conflict? Do you want to know about other wars that have happened that led to the creation of the world the way it is? Do you want to know about various other creatures, other threats that happen to be out there in greater detail than I gave in the last video? Anything you want to know, I want to cover in this series, so don't be shy. I'm doing my best to sort of guess what it is folks would want to know based on what I would want to know if someone had just handed me a new RPG that I had no knowledge of. But it is always better to get it straight from the horse's mouth as to what you all want to know. So, until next time, this has been Tactical Plastic Report. Fall out and have a good day gaming.